All right, welcome to lesson 5. This one is entitled Interwar Foreign Policy. So what we're going to do here is look at U.S. foreign policy between World Wars I and World War II, really right from the end of the First World War right up until our intervention or are getting drawn into the Second World War with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the word interwar, inter of course means between. So this is the period between the two world wars. Now, as we look at this section, we're going to basically try to answer three broad questions. Two of them more so than another, but we'll touch on the other. And these are the types of questions that often come up in essays or possibly DBQs relating to this time period. So the first question is really, to what extent was our foreign policy really isolationist between World War I and we could go all the way to World War II, but even in what we would call the 20s, the period from the very end of World War I, which would be like 1918, 1919, when we're debating the League of Nations, until the election of FDR in 1932. Is that big decade, bigger, maybe a little more than 10-year period that we call the 20s, was it really an isolationist decade? That is the traditional historical interpretation, that after dabbling in imperialism in the late 18 and early 1900s, and then breaking our long-standing neutrality and not, trying to stay out of European affairs, while we break that when we enter World War I, that there's a counter response. We go back into our little isolationist bubble in the 1920s. That's typically how this story is told. And there's some evidence to support that, certainly. But is that really accurate? Or do we see the United States being a little more involved in the 20s than we traditionally think of? So that's the first question we're going to tackle and spend some depth on. And we'll touch on this one, but what was FDR's good neighbor policy and why did he adopt it? So we'll touch on that because that could pop up. And then finally, as we start to move into the 30s and World War II is either imminent or by the end of the decade has broken out, to what extent is America remaining neutral during this period? So, we talked about together our foreign policy when World War I broke out and our attempts to remain neutral and what kind of drew us into that war despite our efforts to stay out. We're going to look at our efforts to stay out of this one as well, and then how FDR kind of maneuvers through a very difficult period. And then really when we get to Pearl Harbor, things get simple. That's the big moment that is going to draw us in, and it's amazing how much public opinion, it's like flipping a switch. Whereas I don't know if I have or if they exist, the polling numbers to support this, but I think it's fair to say that prior to Pearl Harbor, the majority of Americans would have preferred to stay out of World War II. Then after Pearl Harbor, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who's still really calling for neutrality. There might have been a few, but that would have been an unpopular position. So that's kind of what we're going to tackle here. We'll try to move fairly quickly through some of the detail and the evidence, but just kind of paint the bigger picture. In the notes, we're starting on page 22, which is appropriately titled Interwar Foreign Policy. And we're going to start with this first question. Were we really isolationist after World War I and throughout the 1920s? So if you're arguing that, yes, there was American isolationism in the 20s, probably the first piece of evidence you'd point to is the fact that we rejected the League of Nations. So just a quick recap. During World War I, President Wilson conceived of this idea to create a League of Nations, an international peacekeeping body that would hopefully serve to prevent future world wars by bringing the nations of the world together to kind of talk out their differences. It was a controversial thing in the United States because part of the League of Nations charter was that Article 10 that required all member nations to come to the defense of any other nation, member nation that was attacked. So a lot of Americans had objections because this would do a number of things. It would take away from Congress the sovereign authority to declare war, which means that we, the people, wouldn't be deciding when we go to war. It would be this international body. It would violate our long-standing traditional isolationism. We had grown accustomed to kind of being protected by these two great oceans and felt that the problems of the world were not really our problems and we could stay out of them. So it would be a change in tradition and traditional policy. And then also, there was the concerns about how this might lead to a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, that it would maybe open the door for foreign meddling in the Western Hemisphere. So for all of those reasons and the inability for any compromise, the Senate rejected the League of Nations. So you start with that piece of evidence, say, well, there you go, there's proof. The United States is back to its isolation because we rejected the League, and we would not change our minds on that, at least not until after World War II, when we join a new organization called the United Nations. But even within that, you could argue there's really not, this doesn't prove isolationism. I like to remind students that it was our president who championed this league, created it, started it, went to Europe, to the Versailles Conference to promote it. And if he had his way, we'd have joined. The League of Nations will exist even without us. So the United States is certainly playing a role by at least getting this organization started. But also, I would say, well, let's look at what the Senate said. The Senate voted against the Treaty of Versailles. The Constitution requires a 2/3 supermajority to ratify a treaty. Now, they couldn't get that 2/3 majority to approve of the treaty and thus the League. But on just about every vote that was taken, there was at least a simple majority in support of the treaty and of joining the League. So to say that the United States rejected the League sometimes implies that all Americans or all of Congress, all of the Senate was opposed to the League. And you could argue that the president and half of the Senate was in favor. And so that means there must have been some public support for this as well. Okay, so there's the first thing we would want to probably tackle in that essay is talk about the League. But let's go a little further. Little known fact, at least little known amongst Americans, is that our entire army that had been fighting in Europe in World War I did not come home when the war was over. A portion of it, a sizable portion of it, along with armies from other nations in Europe, including Great Britain, went to Russia and participated in, I'll say indirectly, it was more indirect than direct, but they participated in what became essentially the Russian Civil War that followed World War I. So you probably know, we've mentioned that in 1917, there was two revolutions in Russia, the first toppling the Tsarist government, but the second, in the fall, was the one that brought in the Bolsheviks, the communists. And the world was taken aback by this Bolshevik revolution in Russia. But with World War I still raging for at least another year, there wasn't too much that could be done. Well, before the Bolsheviks could kind of solidify their control, there was a civil war going on in Russia. Traditionally, they refer to it as being between the Reds and the Whites, the Reds being the communists, and the Whites kind of being all other um, groups in Russia that oppose the communists. So supporters of the Tsar, supporters of a democracy, and others. So a lot of allied nations came in and offered financial and military support to the whites to try to topple the communists, kind of like nip communism in the bud in Russia before it could really take root. Now, ultimately, we left, and ultimately the communists prevailed. But this intervention, or sometimes we call it this incursion into Russia, and what you're looking at here is a photograph of American soldiers in Russia in the immediate aftermath of the war. Um, this is certainly a sign that the United States is not isolationist. We're taking an active role in trying to kind of steer the course of Russia away from communism. Now, as Americans, we usually don't talk much about this, but I can assure you, in Russian history, they are well aware of this. And this was one of many kind of contributing factors to the Cold War that will exist between the US and Russia coming out of World War II. This is in the back of their minds that we meddled in their civil war. I would say compare this to if maybe Canada or Great Britain um, had meddled in our civil war and maybe taken the side of the Confederates. How might that have hurt our relationship with that country after our civil war was over and the Confederacy was defeated? We might still remember what they did. So to me, that doesn't say isolation. Another big topic, definitely something you want to be aware of, is that in 1921, so the first year of the Harding presidency, the United States hosted an international conference amongst major world powers to discuss the reduction of navies. So it was well understood that one of the causes of World War I was militarism, the buildup of militaries throughout Europe. And because naval strength was kind of the new thing in military power at that time, there was a concerted effort to try to reduce naval forces. Think of this as kind of like in the Cold War era when we would talk about reduction of nuclear arms. Um, Reduction of naval arms was kind of viewed as the surest way to prevent another world war. So the United States, we won't go into the details. You can see in the notes that some of the agreements that came out of this. But I always point to this and say, one, the United States is participating in this disarmament conference, reduction of arms conference. And not only that, we're hosting it. So to me, that doesn't suggest isolation from the world. It suggests we're trying to play an active role in keeping the peace. This is one of the things Wilson had hoped to achieve through a League of Nations was, mutual arms reduction and with efforts to keep the peace. We're doing it. We're just doing it on our terms in kind of this separate conference that we chose to participate in. So I think this also suggests that there's really not a lot of isolation going on here. It's just intervention, but on our terms. If you're noticing the cartoon in the upper right, this is probably from a little bit later on, but there is, you can see in this cartoon, a U-boat, a German submarine poking its head up out of the water. And in the boat are supposed to be symbols of many of the major world powers that had agreed to this naval reduction. And they're all in a boat titled the Washington Conference. And there's concern on their faces that while they were all reducing their navies so that there wouldn't be competition amongst each other, Germany, who was not a party to any of these treaties, they were the vanquished enemy in World War I, and they were considered to be in a pretty weak state in 1921. But over time, especially after Hitler comes to power, they're building up their military, and maybe the Washington Conference had weakened some of the other countries by reducing the building of battleships and submarines and things of that sort. So the Washington Naval Conference, our intervention in this international conference, may have been maybe harmful in the long run. Also, this is another good little somewhat of a footnote to history, but I think, again, it speaks to our involvement in world affairs. So the story of the Kellogg-Briand Pact starts small, but then grows rather large. In the name, you have the names of two representatives. Kellogg, whose first name escapes me right now, he's the American diplomat, and Briand is, as it sounds, the French diplomat. And this starts out as a mutual pact just between the United States and France, where the two of us agree that in our relations with each other, so this really is only between us and France, that we will, as it says, condemn recourse to war as a way of solving our problems. We will renounce war as an instrument of national policy towards each other. So in other words, the United States and France are saying we pledge to each other that if we ever have difficulties in the future, if we ever get into a conflict or a disagreement, we promise that we won't let it result in a war. We'll find peaceful, or as that last highlighted phrase says, we'll find pacific means, peaceful means of resolving our disputes. Now, it starts as a bilateral agreement between the US and France, but many other nations sign on to this agreement. So it actually becomes quite a big world document. But not Germany. I don't believe Japan. Um, what I always like to point out with the Kellogg-Graham Pact is, if you stop and think about it, it kind of sounds like the League of Nations again, right? The League of Nations was this agreement to find peaceful means to resolve disputes. But this is kind of like, in my mind, this is like the League of Nations without Article 10, without that automatic, and if someone violates the pact and invades another country, well, then everybody must come to their defense. So our concern about the League of Nations, that mutual defense agreement that was in Article 10, that's not present here. But it's still the United States engaging with the rest of the world, saying we're going to seek peace and work together to resolve disputes. So what I think about is we look at these last couple of things, the Washington Conference and the Kellogg-Graham Pact. I see in the 20s the United States trying to achieve the same things that Wilson thought his 14 points, and particularly the League of Nations, would solve, but doing it more on our terms, not being as committed to international affairs as maybe the League of Nations would have made us. So I look at these things and say, all right, there's really not a lot of isolation going on. We're dealing with the world as much as ever, just more on our terms. So why do people find that the United States was isolationist in the 20s? Well, I think, again, they look at the rejection of the League, and that's maybe the strongest piece of evidence for it. But I think they also look at things that are only loosely related to foreign policy, things we've already talked about. So if you look in the 1920s, you notice that the United States is once again enacting high tariffs. Now, we'll get to that high tariff in the early 30s under Hoover, the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And then after that, we kind of realized that high tariffs are a bad idea. But in the 20s, we go back to those high tariff policies. And so that, to me, that's not isolation, but it is kind of an economic isolation, trying to protect our economy from foreign competition. So I think some historians do like to point to that as proof of our isolation, but it's a stretch. And then you might also be thinking, in the 1920s, we also enacted real strict immigration laws that tried to keep foreigners out of our country. And that is often cited too as proof of our isolation, or the Palmer raids, or the Red Scare that emerges after World War I. But again, those aren't really foreign policies. Those are more domestic policies that deal with foreign elements. So could they be used as evidence for isolation? Sure, I guess they could. But in terms of our foreign policies, I think we are engaging with the rest of the world. And so this isn't as simple an answer as maybe we make it out to be. All right, so that was kind of our first question about how isolationist were we in the 20s. That brings us to the good neighbor policy, and I just want to touch on this, just want to make you aware of it. So in FDR's inaugural address, so the very first speech he gives as president, and most of that great speech was about the Great Depression and his New Deal. But he does touch on foreign policy, and he says this, he says, in the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself, and because he does, respects the rights of others. Now, when FDR says neighbor, that immediately makes people think about our neighbors, the nations of the Americas, particularly of Latin America. And what FDR is suggesting is that maybe our policy towards those nations over the last few decades hasn't been all that nice, and it's time to change that. So I like this topic for a couple reasons. One, I think what's important to understand is why he wants to suddenly change this policy, or treat the Latin American neighbors better. But I also like to point out that, there's so many similarities between Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, many similarities. I mentioned that they both like to be known by their initials. And in almost all of these, TR, obviously he's older, he came first. FDR was copying him. But, if you look closely, TR liked to wear glasses that had no, what do they call the there's a name for them, but like the arms of your glasses that would go back over your ears to hold them up. Um, TR didn't wear that type. He wore what were called pince-nez glasses. Pince-nez literally means pinch the nose, and they would just sit on the bridge of your nose like that. Well, FDR wore those too. Their political paths were almost identical. Both had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Both had been governor of New York. Um, both ran for vice president. FDR ran in 1920 and lost. TR, of course, won with McKinley in 1900, and then both become president. TR offered a square deal to the American people. FDR had a new deal. You could really go on. And of course, they were both very progressive presidents. But it's on foreign policy where we see a big difference. So I'd love to ask you this question right now. I'm hoping you're already seeing it. But what TR policy does the good neighbor policy of FDR seem to contradict? All right, I'm not calling anybody right now, but of course I'm talking about the Roosevelt corollary. Remember, it was the Roosevelt corollary when TR said, the United States has a responsibility to intervene in Latin America to make sure that our Latin American brothers are upholding their international obligations. And we're not going to let foreign powers come into our hemisphere to discipline our little brothers to the south. We'll go in and do it. We'll be the big brother who disciplines them and restores order, and if need be, props up good, sound governments, whatever the case may be. And that Roosevelt corollary, which turned us into kind of like the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, it also led to numerous interventions by American forces in Latin American countries, some under TR, some under Taft, many of them actually under Wilson. Wilson, maybe more than anybody, intervened in Latin America, even though he talked about a moral diplomacy. He wasn't afraid to send the Marines in, whether it was into Mexico or Cuba or wherever. But FDR is now reversing that. He's saying we have to be good neighbors. We can't be bossing them around. We've got to treat them fairly and respect their rights to govern themselves. So why? Why is he promoting this policy? Well, I'd like to say that it's simply because he's a good man and it's a noble thing to do, or he wants to maybe compensate for this dark legacy of his cousin Teddy. Remember the way Teddy intervened in Panama to get us the canal, also left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. That might have been part of it, but more practically, there's two things I think are going on here. Number one, don't lose sight of the bigger context. FDR is coming into office. He's giving this speech when the Depression is hitting rock bottom. What FDR realizes is we need Latin American nations to buy our stuff. We need good trade relationships with them if we're going to lift ourselves out of this depression. So there's certainly an economic self-interest in having a better relationship with Latin America. So that's kind of the economic angle. But I think FDR also can see a little bit into the future. By 1933, Japan is already starting to act very aggressively in the Pacific. And with the rise of Hitler to power and what Mussolini and Stalin are doing, I think FDR understands that another war is probably gonna come at some point in time, and he's not alone in that. Um, many people realize that a second world war was, hate to say inevitable, but it was likely. So FDR might have also been looking at this from a foreign policy perspective and the need for good allies in Latin America, wanting to make sure that Latin American countries didn't find themselves on the side of the future Axis powers of Germany and Japan and Italy, that they would remain with us and the Allies and they could be partners with us. Keep in mind, too, we have that Panama Canal down there. That's going to be vitally important to World War II. So we certainly don't want the Panama Canal or the countries near it to be on the side of our enemies. So I think FDR certainly is looking ahead with this policy. And a lot of those interventions that the United States had been doing in Latin America do cease in the 1930s. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we're dealing with the Depression, but they will stop. They'll resume during the Cold War era when threats of communism enter the Western Hemisphere, but we won't be able to get into that too much this year. Okay, that brings us now to the 1940s. I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. The 1930s and the onset of World War II. I want to start by making clear, because you always have to do this with history. You can't know the future when you're studying the past. You have to kind of put yourself in that place in time. And this isn't really specific to any moment in time, but I just want you to understand that throughout the 1930s, really right up until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, there is a strong sentiment in the United States that World War I, our involvement in World War I was a big mistake. And we've got to do whatever it takes to stay out of a second world war. So especially as that Second World War seemed more and more imminent, and then officially September 1st, 1939, it had begun, Americans really step up their anti-war efforts, their efforts to remain neutral and isolated and at peace. So, if I had said, what war do you usually think of when I talk about anti-war rallies on college campuses or rallies in opposition to the draft? I'm sure most of you would say, well, that's what I associate with Vietnam. And you'd be right. But of course, this picture we're looking at is college kids who are participating in an anti-war, anti-draft demonstration on a college campus. But this one is in the those years right before Pearl Harbor. So there's a strong anti-war sentiment in the public. Don't lose sight of that. Okay, and I'll keep reinforcing that, but I want to show you how FDR, who's going to definitely want to be more prepared for inevitable war, he's fighting against that. He's trying to lead us down a path where we can be ready for the war and even assisting the Allies, but he's doing that in the context of this strong isolationist neutrality sentiment that is there. Okay, things really pick up in the mid 30s. So I'm not quite ready for this slide yet, but if you're looking at the notes where it says isolation in the face of looming war, the middle of page 23, there's a reference there to the Nye Committee. I think I mentioned this to you guys once before, but in 1934, the Senate establishes a committee to figure out why exactly we did enter World War I. Like, what really caused us to enter World War I? And this committee concluded that it was our economic ties to the Allies, the trade we had done with the Allies, the loans we had granted the Allies, that even though the government was officially neutral during most of World War I, the American people and American businesses and banks were free to do business with whomever they wanted. And for a number of reasons, we talked about these, the trade and the loans and the business all largely favored the Allies. And so the Nye Committee concluded that we entered World War One because we needed to see the Allies prevail if it was going to be financially beneficial to the United States. And it was that Nye Committee who coined the phrase the merchants of death, that American manufacturers and profiteers were like merchants of death, and American soldiers went to Europe and fought for them, for their profits. So I always thought that was odd. Why would this committee be looking into this in 1934? I mean, this is 17 years after we entered World War One. I hate to say who cares, but who cares? It's ancient history now, right? But it really, if you think about it in context of what's going on, they're trying to figure out what drew us into World War One because they're trying to make sure we don't make the same mistake again in World War Two. So now, with that context, we now look at a series of laws that that very same Congress passed in 1935, 6, and 7. And it's hard to sort all these out. It's really not important that you sort them out by year. But if you look at what these laws do, now you get it. These laws are trying to prevent what happened in 1914, 15, 16, and maybe 17 from happening again. So the things that we were allowed to do in World War One, Congress is now preventing us from doing in, we can't say World War II yet, it hasn't begun yet, but we can kind of say that. They're trying to prevent that from history from repeating itself. So the first law, the one you're looking at here, is the Act from 35, and it bans arms sales, selling of weapons to any nation that is at war. Okay? We were allowed to sell weapons, not the government. The government was neutral, but American munitions makers, those who made weapons, were more than allowed to sell them to nations at war in World War One. This law now prohibits it, and it also prohibits U.S. citizens from sailing on ships that fly the flag of a belligerent nation, one of the nations at war. So right there, you might be saying, "Oh yeah, that's right," because it was about 120, 130 Americans who were on board the Lusitania, a British passenger liner that ended up getting sunk, and they all died, and it contributed to our entry into the war. It wasn't a direct cause, but it led us down that path. Now we're going to prevent that from happening. Americans are not allowed. It's at their own risk, and they are prohibited from sailing on those ships. So again, trying to make sure history doesn't repeat itself. The law in 36, yeah, I have an excerpt from that. This bans loans to belligerent nations, so banks cannot lend money. And then in 1930, oh, I don't have a slide for that, but in the 1937 law, now a lot of that law has to do with a Spanish Civil War that broke out and kind of addressing that. But it does back away from this a little bit. The 1937 law does allow the United States or US manufacturers to start shipping goods to belligerents. Now, it still says no weapons, but it says we can now sell goods to belligerent nations, but on a cash and carry basis. So the 1937 law is often referred to simply by that name, cash and carry. It's not exactly moving away from neutrality, but it's recognizing that we are in a depression. Okay, don't forget this is all happening while the depression is still issue number one. And to cut off our trade or our selling of goods to nations just because they might happen to be at war would be harmful to our economy. So we said, okay, well, we'll sell to them, but they got to pay cash. They cannot buy things on credit. So we're not going to be waiting to get this money. The money is paid up front. Okay, that was one of the concerns about why we went into World War One, that we needed to get our money back. And they've got to come and pick that stuff up and carry it home on their ships. So it won't be U.S. ships, U.S. merchant vessels that are carrying these goods into a war zone that could get sunk by German subs or, whomever. They're going to ship them home at their own risk. So cash and carry is still being neutral, but it's at least allowing for some trade to go on. All right, that takes us now. I'm going to introduce here another reminder of our desire for neutrality. This is a kind of a fascinating story in the midst of all of this that's going on. But an organization forms in the late 30s called the America First Committee. And there are really many of these throughout the country. They're kind of loosely united nationally, but there's like local committees in every major town. And they're filled with Americans who want to remain neutral and isolated and put American interests first. Who cares if Europe and Asia are tearing each other apart and about to go to war or at war? We need to focus on what's important for America. And again, still, it's dealing with the Depression. Millions of Americans join the America First Committee or America First movement. It really gives us a good sense of American public opinion. You can see in this picture, there's a portrait of George Washington, not only a symbol of American values, but a symbol of our policy of isolation and neutrality. And the most prominent spokesperson of the America First movement is a man named Charles Lindbergh. I don't know if we've mentioned him in class, but you might know him as a very famous pilot, first to fly across the Atlantic solo. Really one of, if not maybe the biggest celebrity in America in the 1920s, and his fame continues into the 30s. Good looking young man. He was kind of the all American boy. Many women were in love with him. And so he became the spokesperson of this movement, and that certainly helped its cause. I don't want to come back to them, but I'll tell you a quick little side story. There was a big America First rally going on in Pittsburgh on December 7th, 1941. And in the midst of that rally, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, that's way, way far away from Pittsburgh. But when news of the attack reaches Pittsburgh, someone goes up to the speaker. I don't know if it was Lindbergh, but whoever was speaking at that time at this big rally, he goes up and hands him a little note that says, Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, we're at war. And on one hand, you'd think, well, that's it. I mean, the America First Committee is probably done at that moment. And they pretty much are. But the speaker reads it and then kind of crumples it up, puts it in his pocket, and goes on speaking. Now, I don't know if he didn't believe it or if he said, doesn't change my opinion. But again, I think this highlights just how strong the desire was in America to not get involved in this war. Okay. As an excerpt from Lindbergh's speech. So what I was saying is, what I want you to see is how there's really a strong desire to stay out of the war, but FDR recognizes that the United States cannot put its head in the sand. We cannot pretend like there isn't a war going on. And if I could give you a quick timeline here, just so you appreciate, when things are happening. I don't have a detailed timeline to show you, but just a couple key dates. I'm going to start 1931. 1931 is when Japan first invades a part of China called Manchuria. And that kind of gets us on high notice. The United States, remember, we want an open door trade policy in China. Japanese takeover of China would certainly interfere with that. So the United States in 1931 cares, but we don't really respond in any profound way. But I always say that's kind of the beginnings of World War II, all the way back in 1931. Then in 1937, Japan invades mainland China. And so now you've really got a war going on in Asia. And the United States will kind of adjust its response to that. 38 is when Hitler starts kind of getting on the move. In 38, I believe, is the year he kind of annexes Austria to Germany and then invades part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. So he's certainly starting to build an empire. That's got everybody on notice. Then it's in 39 when he completes his conquest of Czechoslovakia, invades Poland, which is really the start of it all. Um, and now World War II is on. Britain, France, the Soviets, everybody is kind of mobilizing against Germany and Italy. Italy got aggressive a little bit earlier, mid 30s, just to kind of put that in there. But remember, September 39, Pearl Harbor isn't until December 41. So there's still 2 years in which the war is going and the United States is still officially neutral. And FDR is trying to, like I said, walk a fine line between respecting public opinion, that we want to stay out, but also recognizing that if we don't help the Allies, the Germans and the Japanese will overrun their respective continents, and we will be left alone, and it'll be too late. And so I know with the New Deal, I'm a little more critical of FDR, or I try to balance it out and point out some of the maybe the flaws in his planning. I think this is FDR in his finest hour, is how he handles the events of 1940, 1941. So there's a lot of detail in there um, that I could get into, and I would suggest you look at the evolution of events on page 24 in your notes. Cash and carry is expanded in 1939. In 1940, FDR makes what's called the Destroyers for Bases deal, trying to give the British um, some of our naval ships so that they can fight. Then, very important, in 1940, I mean, we're still talking more than a full year before Pearl Harbor, Congress implements a draft. This is the only draft in American history that is enacted in peacetime. But I think it speaks volumes for how we realize a war is imminent. And there's a lot of uproar when Congress does that with FDR's, kind of insistence. There are many people in the public who think, oh no, he's trying to lead us into a war. You don't draft men unless you know you're going to war. And that hurts him a little bit in that 1940 election. It's not as lopsided as his previous ones have been. He does say a lot of things that suggest, we might be heading towards war. But then the big one is the Lend-Lease Act. And this is kind of where we'll end this portion. There's more detail you can look at, but I think this is a big one. As I said earlier, FDR understands that if we don't help the Allies, it's going to be too late, and they're going to fall. And we're going to have a Nazi-controlled Europe and an imperialist Japanese-controlled Asia, and the United States is going to be, yeah, we're going to be free and over here protected by those two great oceans, but the rest of the world is going to be under the control of two terrible uh, groups. And then what? And really, how long is it then before the United States itself falls victim to them? So FDR gives one of his famous fireside chats. A lot of those deal with the Depression and the New Deal, but he continues them into World War II. And he's trying to sell the American people on a new law called Lend Lease. And he uses a great analogy. He says, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him your garden hose, or you don't refuse to lend him your garden hose. You just give him your garden hose, and you just hope that he'll give it back when the fire's out. But why do you do that? Now, you do it hopefully because you're a nice person, you're a good neighbor, to use his phrase from earlier. You do it because if he doesn't put out the fire in his house, then that fire is going to spread to your house. And so you're really protecting yourself by doing it. And if you follow that analogy, take it one step further. By lending him your garden hose to fight his fire, you're not going to have to fight his fire or one of your own. So do you see what he's saying here? FDR's point is if we don't offer more tangible assistance to the Allies so that they can put out the fires in Europe and in Asia, not only will those fires spread to the United States, but we're going to then have to fight. So if you want to stay isolated and neutral, if you don't want to get involved in World War II, well, then you better be willing to arm and supply and fund those who are fighting it now. Otherwise, you are going to end up fighting it. So the best way to stay isolated is to aid the Allies. Okay, and that's very logical. I think he's spot on, and a lot of Americans agreed with him. They understood the logic. So that's what the Lend-Lease Act is. It's a policy whereby the United States would, and I love the terms, lend and lease various weaponry, war material, really whatever is needed, including money, to the Allies. Now we'll give it to Britain and France and Canada. I mean, you can see in this map where it's going. We're also giving a lot of it to the Soviet Union, although the Soviets are critical that it's slow on arriving and we're doing it begrudgingly. This is the communist Soviet Union. We're not thrilled with them, but we know that they're vitally important to stopping the Nazi threat. We're giving a lot of it to China as well. Now, we're saying lend and lease, which makes it seem like, oh, someday they're going to give it back. They're going to give these planes and these ships and these bullets and all this back. Of course, they're not going to do that. But that's how FDR has to kind of sell it to the American people. This isn't aid. This is just a loan, like that garden hose. But this is vitally important. Many of the Allied nations say that without this aid, they might not have made it to fight another day. This came just in time. And so we'll kind of end this lesson with Pearl Harbor. I'm not going to go into the details on Pearl Harbor. I'm assuming you know more of what happened. But as I said at the beginning, this is the turning point. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, not only do we respond the very next day with a declaration of war on Japan and thus enter World War II, but as I also said, public opinion shifts. Now there's great support for us entering the war. And in many ways, this is a huge turning point in American history. Because you know that going back now a couple months, we've been talking about American foreign policy and its kind of evolution for most of our history. So think back to 1789 all the way here to 1941. For most of that time, the United States foreign policy has been built on two main ideas: that we are isolated from the world and we are neutral in especially European affairs. Now, beginning in the late 1800s, the age of imperialism, think TR, World War I, what we just discussed in the 20s and 30s, America was wrestling with that. We started to see a movement towards interventionism, towards playing a bigger role in the world, but still that desire to kind of stay isolated and neutral. Well, Pearl Harbor doesn't just bring us into World War II. Pearl Harbor basically ends that debate. From that moment forward, the United States has largely supported an interventionist foreign policy, and you see that all the way up to the present day. While certainly there are some Americans who think we should, you know, mind our own business and stay focused on our own affairs, I think history has taught us an important lesson that the world without an active American presence in it is a much more dangerous world. And the world benefits from the United States playing a role. That is a debatable subject right there, but in my opinion, the United States does need to be involved in the world. We have to be careful, and that doesn't mean we get involved in everything. And we should do it not just seeking our own interests, but seeking the well-being of all the people of the world. But an isolationist United States, I think, would be a disaster for everybody. So we'll end this lesson with that. Hopefully you'll have questions and we can discuss those in office hours.